Glenlee from the Ocean Liner Enthusiast channel, and today I am presented with an extremely special opportunity with Lauren here, who is the museum manager for the tall ship in Glasgow. So how are you doing today, Lauren?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to talk to you.
Yeah, well, thank you for inviting me, honestly, because I didn't think I'd be here, honestly. So we've got a few questions here lined up. Obviously this has been getting planned for a while. I've been trying not to talk about it too much, but I got too excited and did say a few things. But yeah, I've just got a couple of questions about the ship and let's get into it.
Let's go.
So this is the first question. It's just, so obviously there was the Storm Eowyn event recently, devastated the UK a wee bit. Did the ship sustain any damage during the storm? Or?
I don't think it did. I mean, when you talk to one of the crew later on, she might be able to tell you a little bit more. But you also have to remember, this ship's been through a lot more hardships than a small storm. So this ship went around Cape Horn. She's been in hurricanes, tornadoes. Yeah. So I think this is just small fry compared to that. But no, she came through fine. She was checked on daily. Not bad at all. That's
perfect. Because I was worried when I saw the news about it and I saw the damage around my house and that. I was like...
Yeah, I think if she had her sails up, that would have been catching more wind and more movement. But
that'd be a problem, yeah. So my next question here is just, how did the museum in general come to gain ownership of the Glenlee?
Yeah, so in the late 80s, early 90s, Glasgow was really seeing that all that Clyde-built heritage that was so prominent, that made Glasgow such a wonderful city, had been disappearing since the First and Second World War. Yeah. So they really wanted to create some sort of trust that would safeguard that heritage and tell that story. Yeah. And they thought the most effective and most visually impressive way of doing that was to have a ship that was built on the Clyde, back on the Clyde. Yeah. So the Clyde Maritime Trust was set up in the early 90s, and they did some research to try and find a ship that was in good nick that could be taken back to the Clyde. Yeah. So there was a few good options, but the best one that they found was a ship called Galatea, which was in Spain, in Seville. They went out to visit. They realised that this was indeed a Clyde-built ship. They did some research, and they realised that this was Glenlee. She was launched as Glenlee, but had various names over her history. Yeah. So thankfully they did this at this point, because Galatea was very close to going to auction, and the auction took place. We won, thankfully. The competing bidder was actually a Dutch scrap merchant. Yeah. And if they had bought the ship, they would have scrapped her and used her for a metal. Apparently the story goes that the Dutch actually won the auction. They had made a higher bid, but they had only currency in guilders. Okay. But the Clyde Maritime Trust had the right currency. So it was more convenience than actually having won the auction. So thankfully we won it. Yeah. And then the next year, 1993, the ship was towed back to Glasgow over 9 days. So she was out through the Bay of Biscay, up through the Channel, into Greenock. She was put into dry dock there for a wee while. And then she was taken to York Hill for her first 10 years back on the Clyde. And then she came to in front of the Riverside in 2011. Yeah,
that's really interesting. Because also I did see there was information stuff here about the ship. Did say it was from Italy. You said it was in
Spanish.
Spanish, sorry, yeah.
Spanish.
Because I did find that interesting how it's like managed to get from Glasgow to Spain, and obviously the whole shipbreakers thing as well. It's the whole story. Very scary thought, and that's been the whole story of the Glenlee from her 128 years. There's been so many near misses that she almost got scrapped after the First World War. I almost got scrapped in the 1920s, almost got scrapped in the 1950s. Yeah. It's only been through people who love her and want to preserve her, change her function, and that is what saved her. It's not necessarily been because she deserved to be saved, it's because we love her. Yeah. And that's just her story. I know. You said about a Clyde-built ship as well. I've always had the thought the Queen Mary should be back here, not in California. Well, at least she's getting looked after, and there's people with money there looking after her, so that's a good thing. She's kind of getting looking after. It's debatable.
There's no money here for anybody other trip, that's the problem.
No, she's too big. But my next question it's a maintenance question. Did you say there was someone else I should ask about this?
Yeah, Rose can ask.
Yeah, I'll save that for later on then, yeah. That's fine. Well, there's a question here, has the Glenlee been involved in any significant historical events to name?
She sailed for 128 years, or has been... She has been in existence for 128 years, so she's seen a fair bit of history. Yeah. During the First World War, she was Isle Mount cargo ship years, and she was sailing a lot during that time. She was sailing in the South Pacific. Okay. And there was German U-boats looking out for British cargo ships at that time. Right. Because the First World War is a bit of an unusual war, because usually opposing navies would only target navies. But the First World War was significant because the German Parliament said unrestricted submarine warfare because they were really proud of their U-boats.
Yeah.
So there was quite a notorious U-boat commander called Van Spee, I believe, and he was in the South Pacific and he would target British cargo ships.
Yeah.
Thankfully for us, we managed not to be targeted. Again, more out of luck than anything else. A lot of cargo ships either dazzled themselves. Have you seen pictures of them?
I've seen the dazzle camouflage, yeah.
And sometimes cargo ships were part of convoys.
Yeah, the convoys.
Of naval ships. But the problem with that is that U-boats can hear noise. So if you've got a convoy, you can hear the engines.
Yeah.
And because we were a sail ship sailing alone, we could be quiet and just get in and out without any problems. So the First World War came through that pretty fine. The other more notable thing that we were involved in was the Spanish Civil War.
Okay.
So this ship was Spanish from 1922 all the way up to 1992. And during the Spanish period, she was a training ship. So any young Spanish lad who wanted to join the Navy would do a training cruise on this ship, which is exciting. So when the Spanish Civil War broke up in 1936, this ship was in the middle of the ocean, lots of young lads and a crew on board.
Yeah.
And what happened was that the coup happened, the military coup, so the fascist rebels tried to gain control of their country. And the Republican government sent out a message to all the ships in the Spanish Navy telling them to come back to Spain to fight for the government, the legitimate government. On most ships, this was received by the radio officers. The radio officers would tell the rest of the crew, and then they'd mutiny against their captain and their officers, because they would be more aligned with the rebels, whereas the crew would want the government to continue.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, on Galatea, the radio room was not working, and the only radio on board was the captain's.
Right.
So the captain heard this message, and because he was more aligned with the rebels, he didn't tell the rest of the crew that their country was at war. So he sailed the ship back not to the government-held port, but to the rebel-held port. And so he gave Galatea to the Francoist rebels rather than the government. And then 3 years later, Franco won, and Spain was a fascist dictatorship all the way up until 1975. So I'm not saying that we were a pivotal part in that, but it's interesting that we were on the wrong side of history at that point.
I think, to be fair, even if the Glenlee was there, I don't think it would have made too much of a difference.
Well, you have to think, it's a training ship.
Yeah.
And they didn't necessarily have people who could fight. So they could use this as a training ship as a resource to actually get people ready to fight for the wrong side.
True, yeah.
So very, very small part, but it's quite interesting.
Yeah. Well, that actually tied into one of my later questions, which was about the wars, the First and Second War.
Yeah.
So obviously you said it was involved a little bit as a convoy ship.
No, it wasn't a convoy ship. It was because it was alone. It could skip.
Could be misinterpreted as a car. Yeah. And what about the Second World War? Was there any use there?
Not really. So after the Spanish Civil War, that finished in 1939, and then that started the Second World War. Spain at that time was ostensibly a neutral country during the Civil War, the Second World, sorry.
Yeah.
But Franco was always going to be on the side of Hitler. So nothing really happened during the Second World War. We just carried on training and carried on as normal.
Yeah. Right. Well, I've got another question here, and it's just because I've noticed the ship's obviously it's very gorgeous inside.
Thank you.
Was it ever used as a passenger vessel in any capacity?
No, she's had various functions. So she was built as a cargo ship. Then she had her years as a training ship from 1922 to 1959. Then she was a static training ship. And then she's been converted into a visitor attraction. So never a passenger ship.
Yeah.
The only people you can maybe consider as passengers, sometimes the captain had a wife on board. So she wouldn't have any function on board, but she was there.
Yeah.
So that could be construed as passenger, but it was never a commercial passenger ship.
Yeah, right, that's... Well, I've got another question here, and it's what type of cargo would the ship have typically carried on a voyage?
Anything, basically. So this was always a sailing ship when she was a cargo ship. The engines came in later. And because we were the tail end of the sailing ship era, we basically took what we could get. So the steamships would have gotten the good cargo that made more money.
Yeah.
So we basically couldn't be too picky. So we would have grain, usually wheat, on board. That would come from Australia up to Europe. We'd have timber, coal or oil, case oil would be on board. Guano was quite a notorious cargo. So guano is bird or bat poo from South America. So all these British ships would sail into the Guano Islands just off Peru, and they'd fill their hold with sacks full of dried poo, and they'd sail it up to Europe.
Yeah.
And this would be synthesised down for fertiliser because it had really good nitrates on board, or it could be used for explosives. But the crew hated having that on board because it stank. It gave them headaches and nosebleeds. Not a very happy cargo at all.
Yeah, I can imagine it would be rather unpleasant to deal
Very
with.
unpleasant. And even when it was off, you had to clean the ship from top to bottom, which is quite a big job indeed.
Yeah. Well, here's another question. We did discuss this earlier on before the camera was on, but it's how much of the ship, to the knowledge of the crew, is actually original?
Ooh, that's a very, very good question. Because the ship's lasted so long, that has meant that she's been through many phases of use that we've already talked about.
Yeah.
So technically, if you think that if you're calling original coming from 1896 when she was built, just the hull and the frames and the ribs, that would be all I would say is original, 128 years old, which is very little.
Yeah.
But again, it just tells a story of survival. So the deck that we're sitting on now, the tween deck, that would have been put in when she was a training ship.
Okay.
Because from weather deck down would have just been an empty space for your cargo.
Oh.
So the crew would generally just have lived on the weather deck. When she was converted to being a training ship, you were going from a crew of around 26 to a full complement of around 350 on board.
Yeah.
So this deck and the lower hold deck would be put in for accommodation for a huge amount of people on board. And then the Spanish also changed an awful lot of what was going on in the weather deck. So that all got transformed into being a training ship. So when the ship came back from Seville in 1993, the Trust really wanted her to look like what she did during her cargo ship years.
Yeah.
So a lot of the Spanish infrastructure was pulled off.
Okay.
And then a lot of what you see in the weather deck now was re-established. So it's a restoration, it's a recreation.
So this is her as her Clyde built self.
As much as they can do. Yeah. It's not something I necessarily agree was the right choice, but that's what they saw the priority as being.
Because it would have been nice to have all the layers of our history preserved.
Yeah, I think so. But then you have to think about, how does this ship make money to carry on surviving? Yeah. So one of the things that we have on board is events, like weddings. So if we'd kept all her Spanish infrastructure on this deck, it would be full of small spaces. But because we have large spaces, we can use it as an event space. Right. Which sounds a little bit contradictory, because you want things to be real, you want things to be authentic, but you also have to think, how can we continue doing all these things? Because looking after a ship's expensive. So we need to be making money. So as a museum manager, it does make me sad that there's little authentic on the ship, but you have to be sensible about how you make money and how you carry on.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. My next question here, you said about obviously the scrapping close calls. Has she had any other kind of close call incidents with like collisions or anything like that?
She survived a hurricane coming into Sydney in 1918. So there's some pictures I can send you if you'd like of the masts all skew with, and I think they only just managed to get through it. They had to get towed into Sydney Harbour through the James Patterson tug, so she looked very, very sad. But she was able to be re-established and carry on. Yeah. So that was quite a close call. She's been around Cape Horn about 15 times, so I think doing that so often is always a close call, just depending on the wind condition. After the First World War, she was in a port in Italy, and there was a long time that they weren't sure what was going to happen to her, because a lot of sailing ships saw their end after the First World War because she didn't have an engine, she was seen as obsolete, it was unsafe to have a ship without an engine. So a lot of ships were scrapped. We could have been scrapped at that point. Yeah. But thankfully for us, because her Clyde built bones were so good still after 20 years, we were purchased by an Italian company, and they put the first engines on board, they put generators on board, they modernised her, and then that led her to being purchased by the Spanish Navy. Yeah. So again, a really big fundamental change, but that has again survived. I'm pretty sure she survived. Yeah. All the way to 2025.
Thank goodness she's here, because she's amazing. She's amazing. I've got a follow-up question actually about the engine. Yeah. So obviously the engine's at the stern. Is the propeller still fitted on there, or is that gone?
So the engines that you see nowadays are engines that were put in by the Spanish in the 1950s. The first engines were put in the 1920s by the Italians, and we think there might have been a middle engine at some point as well. So when the ship was taken back from Seville, they didn't know if the propellers were there or not, because it was still underwater. So it wasn't until she went into dry dock at Greenock, they drained the dock, and there was two propellers. Oh. And they were taken off because you don't have propellers on the ship if you're not going to use them. It's just problematic. Yeah. So for a long time, the propellers were on the quayside at York Hill, where the Clydeside distillery now is. Oh. But when we came back here, there was nowhere to put them, display them safely, because propellers are valuable metal. You can't really have them on display without
bronze. I think
they're bronze, exactly. Yeah. So they were in our workshop for a long time, and didn't know what to do with them. But they are now at the Clyde Maritime College, part of the City of Glasgow College, on the other side of the river. Oh. So if you go in there, in the courtyard, there's two propellers that are ours.
That's amazing.
I know.
That's
I
really
have
cool.
never visited them. I really need to.
I'll need to visit them.
Yeah.
I'll need to see if I can take a drive down after the
You should
interview. Yeah. Just this quite a simple question, honestly. This one. What would the day aboard the ship generally look like for the crew?
Historically.
Historically.
Yeah. So a day on board would be divided into 4-hour shifts. So a working life was always 4 hours working, 4 hours sleeping, so on and so forth. So half the crew would work, half the crew would sleep at any given time. There is a period in the late afternoon called dog watch, and these are 2-hour shifts, and that enabled the crew to have their dinner, relax a little bit, socialise, sing their songs, have their wee fights, play cards, and then they'd go back to 4 hours, 4 hours, 4 hours.
Yeah.
It's actually a really clever way of breaking up the day, because by having these 2 shorter shifts, it means that everybody's shifts move forward one, so you're not doing the same thing at the same time every single day. And the day is broken up by the bell, so you're always listening out for the bell. So within a 4-hour period, the bell's ringing every half hour, and it accumulates a peal per half hour. So half an hour into a shift, you'd ring once, an hour it would ring twice, so on till 8 bells, and then end of watch, change over. So you're always listening out for that 8 bells.
Yeah.
So on a normal shift, you would probably spend an awful lot of time up the mast, because that's the main way of making sure the ship's moving in the correct way. So there'd be somebody at the wheel at the back, there would be somebody probably up the forecastle keeping an eye out, and they would be communicating, and then there would be messages going up and down the mast saying up the sails up, sails down, moving things around. So that would be your main focus. You would very rarely come below deck, because your cargo's down here. If it's nice and safe, you don't need to bother with it when you're at sea. So yeah, that would be it. Really hard work, and that's why your shifts are short, because 4 hours of intense physical labour, you don't want that longer than 4 hours, so you can just go sleep and then start over again. Yeah.
Well, I mean, a follow-up then, you did say historically or like today, what's the day aboard the ship look like today then?
Well, that would be a good question for Rose, I think. So she's on the ship more than I am.
Yeah.
But it's when we're open to the public, it's just making sure everything's nice and open and safe for the public, and then making sure the jobs are getting done, the maintenance job that keep the ship looking good. But again, Rose can go into more detail then.
That's fine. And this is the one of the last 2 questions I've got here, and it's just, what company built the ship?
So the ship was built by the Anderson Roger company, and that is based in Port Glasgow, so down the river. So the funny thing about this ship is that she is a Clyde built ship, but she's not technically a Glasgow built ship. She's a Port Glasgow built ship.
Right.
And so I always make the joke that we're kind of like the opposite of the Waverley. The Waverley is a Glasgow built ship, but she's not a Clyde built ship, because she was built in the River Kelvin.
Was she?
Yeah, so she was built by the Ingle shipyard, which is now where the Riverside Museum now is. And so their slipway and their construction was on the Kelvin, not on the river.
Just over there then? Oh wow.
Yeah, so
she's not very far then, is she? She's
not very far at all. She's within spitting distance.
At the Science Museum.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, Anderson Roger, they built the ship and they ran her for 2 years. And after 2 years, she was sold to a Dundee company and then on to a Liverpool company, and they renamed her Isle of Mount. So she was only Glenlee for 2 years.
That's mental.
It is, yeah.
Well, my final question here, it's about the canteen area.
Oh yes, you're very fond of that.
Oh yeah, that cheese toast I had last time was amazing, honestly. Just like, to your knowledge, do you know what the food in the canteen, is that what they would have ate?
Oh god, no.
Aboard the ship? No. What would they have eaten then?
Very, very poor, to be honest. So there would have been a cook on board. So on board a ship like this, you would have the crew who are doing the mast, the cargo, the hard work. Above them, but below the captain and his officers, you had a class of men who came with more specialised skills. So you've got the sailmaker, the carpenter, and the cook was one of these. So they were paid more. And the cook was in charge of supplying the ship. So when he was in port, he would make sure there was enough food for, it could be up to 3 months. So you really have to think about what food could be kept on board for that long. Because you're not having refrigeration, you don't have freezing facilities. So you're thinking about food that could be salted, salt meat, salt fish. You have things that could be dried, a lot of dried food like flour and wheat and peas and lentils, things like that. And then pickled vegetables and things. So they had a lot of tatties. They keep talking about how they're sick to death of tatties. One of the jobs that they had to do was pick through the tatties and chuck the rotten ones overboard. So there would have been probably bread cooked every day at least, probably stews and soups. Tea kept them going constantly. They're always talking about tea on board. On a Sunday they might get something slightly nicer, but time doesn't really mean the same thing on board. So if you got nice food, that must mean it's a Sunday.
Yeah.
The captain and his officers would probably have the majority the same as the rest of the crew. But if you've been up to the captain's quarters, you'll see he's got a wee pantry and there's tin food. So that's really early tin food.
Yeah.
So he might get some tinned rice pudding, something a little bit nicer to supplement your diet. So it's not nice, but it's just enough to keep you going until your next shift.
Yeah.
And if worst comes to worst, you'd be given a biscuit. So that's the infamous ship's biscuit or hardtack, which is flour, a wee bit of salt, cooked for a long time. You get really, really hard, because the harder it is, the longer it can last storing.
Yeah.
A ship's biscuit could be stored on board for years before it's needed. So you'd be given your biscuit, you'd be given some sort of liquid, stew or soup. You'd knock your biscuit against your table, and then you'd brush away all the little creepy crawlies that live in the biscuit, and then you'd dunk it, and then it would kind of turn into a porridge, and that's how you eat your biscuit. And again, it's not meant to be delicious, it's just horrible. Pure energy, exactly. But they've actually done studies on ship's biscuits recently, and they've actually found it's a really efficient storage of energy. Yeah. So it's like being given a protein bar or an energy bar nowadays, that it's very slow release energy. Again, not delicious, but it keeps you going.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your side of the questions. What was the other crew members in here? So we're going to move on to some questions for Rose here, and then that'll be it then.
Thank you very much.
So much.
You're very welcome.
So I'm sitting here with Rose. How are you doing today, Rose?
Very good, thank you.
Good. I'm doing brilliant, thank you so much. So I've just got a couple of questions about the ship's maintenance, if that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so my first question is, like, how often would you say the ship needs maintenance?
All the time. There's always something. So we do the kind of the more traditional maintenance, so looking after the deck, maintaining the rigging, and also the maybe slightly more modern, like when the toilets stop working, we go fix them as well. So there is literally always something that needs to be done.
Yeah, I can imagine, because the ship's extremely old, so it's
exactly
going to be constantly needing
I mean,
done.
even just the deck itself. So we cork the deck, so replace the stuff in between each of the deck boards.
I noticed
just
that.
Watertight.
Black stuff.
Yeah. So underneath that, there's oakum, which would have been old ropes. It's not anymore. But it's a plant fibre, which we hammer in, and then we pour melted tar on top of it to seal it. So, like, just that would be a full-time job. But it needs to be dry when we do it, and we live in Glasgow, so, you know.
No work.
No.
Well, my next question here. Yes, that
is
right. It. The day yeah.
No, I wouldn't mind a 4-hour shift. It really can vary, so it depends entirely on what else is going on, whether we're open to the public, what the weather's doing. Like I said, the walking needs a good day. If we're working up in the rigging, then that also ideally needs to be a good day, because I know they would have done it back in the day, but it's pretty miserable when it's cold and windy up there.
Yeah.
Let alone if it's raining. So it depends a lot. So if the weather's good, then maybe we'd be up the masts, looking after the rigging up there, or we might be caulking the decks, or we've been paying a lot of attention to the steelwork and painting the ship to protect it. It gets very, very rusty. Even though we're not at sea, I'm sure it would have been much worse if it was salt water that was getting into it. But we've been sort of stripping the steelwork back to bare steel and then painting it so that it doesn't keep corroding. So that's a huge job, but also needs to be a good sunny day.
Yeah.
At the moment, we've got a lot of work going on downstairs. They're getting ready to, they're getting ready to do some shot blasting down there. So they're taking all of the ballast out at the moment. Not all of it, but they're taking ballast out at the moment so they can get to the bits and the bilges that they need to be able to get to. So we're sort of working round them a little bit. We're banned from the cargo hold at the moment. But yes, there's usually some sort of hammering, thumping, needle gunning, some sort of horrible noise that upsets everybody else going on.
I know, it interrupted me and Lauren when we were trying to talk. It was like it was right under us.
it vibrates so much. If we're if we're needle gunning upstairs on the steelwork at the sides, you can hear it. It's almost worse being down here than it is being right next to it outside, because it all just reverberates through the steel. It's so, as you can hear, it's super loud. They're probably not even hitting anything very hard down there. The noise really, really travels through the
because it's
through the skeleton of the ship.
Empty space. So.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time today.
No worries.
Hello everybody, this has been Logan Conley from the Ocean Liner Enthusiast channel. I really hope you enjoyed today's video. This has been in the works for about a month now, and I couldn't be happier with how it came out. Thank you so much to Lauren Henning for allowing me to have this interview. She's been absolutely supportive and amazing through the whole thing, and it was just possibly, it has been one of the best things I've ever done in my life. I didn't think I'd get this far so quickly after only making about 4 history videos. But yeah, stay tuned, we've got more interviews possibly coming up and more amazing content. I can't wait to see where this goes, and thank you so much for watching. Have a lovely day or evening where you are, and goodbye.